Hi, and welcome all to Africa at Noon. Thank you very much for attending this lecture. So I would like to briefly and appropriately introduce Nancy Demerdash-Fatemi for today's talk. And then we will have the Q&A after her presentation. So Nancy Demerdash-Fatemi is an assistant professor of art history at Albion College, where she has taught since 2018. She earned her bachelor, master's, and doctorate degrees from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So welcome back, Nancy. The Aga Khan Program for Islamic Architecture at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and the Department of Art and Archaeology at Princeton University, respectively. Her published work has appeared in Perspective, Actualité en Histoire de l'Art, the Journal of North African Studies, the Journal of Arabian Studies, the Journal of African Literature Association, and the Textile Museum Journal, among others. And from 2016 to 2021, she served as an assistant editor at the International Journal of Islamic Architecture. Currently, she is preparing her book manuscript about the intersections of decolonization and development in post-war modernist architecture and urbanism of Tunisia. And she has a contract with University of Nebraska Press. So without further ado, I would like to invite you all to welcome Nancy Demerdash for her talk and the Q&A discussion afterwards. Thank you very much. Hi, Nancy.
I don't know. I'm sorry. I don't, you probably saw on the screen, I had this message appear that said your connection is unstable. So I apologize. That's what just happened now. I hope that maybe if I stop my video, it might, the connection might improve. So actually, while I'm presenting, if that's all right, I might just stop my video. Is that all right, everyone?
Yes, that sounds great. Thanks, Nancy.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, so first of all, I'd love to, are you seeing my screen, just to be clear?
We are not.
You are not, okay. Let me see, desktop 2.
That looks perfect.
Okay, that looks perfect. Okay, wonderful. Ugh, I try to get rid of this sidebar. I apologize. Oh, goodness. Leave it for technological difficulties, but that's all right. Hopefully this is, are we good now?
We're good.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. All right. Welcome everybody on the call, and thank you for carving out time during your lunch hour to hear about Bisa Butler. I'd also like to thank Professor Navina Nusri for her generous invitation to present for the Africa Studies program. The paper I'm about to present today actually stems from an article I just published for the Textile Museum Journal in its special issue on African textiles. The title of my talk, as you can see, is called The Fabric of Diaspora, Memory, Portraiture, and Empowerment in the Quilts of Bisa Butler. Okay. My article examines the intermedial fiber arts practice of the contemporary African-American artist Bisa Butler, who, in referencing historic photographic archives of African-American lives, materially reinscribes new interpretations of the past through quilts of vivacious colors, prints, and patterns. I will get into the specifics of how I came to Bisa Butler's oeuvre later in the program, but for now, I'd like to introduce you to all of the dimensions that render her work so powerful. Just as Butler layers fabrics in her quilts, she also highlights the photographic and archival palimpsest of African American history, giving prominence to and rendering palpable memories and stories that have been obscured in the historical record. One of the most powerful dimensions of her work rests in her ability to translate the immediacy and intimacy of Black and white photographic portraiture into large-scale polychromatic portrait quilts, recreating faces and figures with a dizzying array of patterned and printed fabrics. She manages to marry the intimacies of portraiture, a mode of expression common to painting and photography alike, with the inherent intimacies of textiles. Butler, who is now an acclaimed fiber artist and sort of self-proclaimed quilter in her own right, was trained actually as a painter. But immediately upon her graduation from Howard University, Butler also became a mother. This pivotal transition in her personal life shifted her choice of medium, as she then turned to collage as a potential alternative, inspired in part by the legacy of the American artist Romare Bearden. In spite of the fact that she began sewing at a young age, quilting did not become a hallmark of her own until this maternal rite of passage, at which point she could no longer physically tolerate the noxious smells of paints, paint thinners, and other chemicals used in her original métier. Experiments with collage and found materials afforded a different sort of freedom to her praxis. Later, while a master's student in arts education at Montclair State University in New Jersey, two other events swiftly altered her trajectory as an artist: a fiber arts course she took, and a portrait quilt she crafted in 2001 entitled Francis and Violette, Grandparents, which you're seeing here on the screen. The quilt, based on a family photo of her grandmother on her wedding day, was both a class project and a gift to cheer her sick grandmother, who was also born in Louisiana. The lush purple African violets printed against the black cloth frame the tender scene, quilted and appliqued, featuring her grandparents. Instead of a picture frame, she has created a quilted frame. So what has now become her signature métier and medium, that is the quilted medium, began from an autobiographical reflection and experiment. Working with a rich body of collected historic photographic reference of African and African-American subjects, Butler patches vibrant scraps of a range of materials, including silks, wools, velvets, even Ghanaian kente cloths, which is, as I'll explain in a bit, an homage to her paternal heritage, to reinvent their likeness in an arrestingly photorealistic manner. Purposefully, her sitters, often nameless in the historical record, gaze back at the viewer as if to affirm their identity and instantiate their existence. Contrasting textures and colors not only breathe life into the figures, but notably their skin transforms into deliberate palettes of aubergines, crimsons, corals, azures, as though captured through infrared or night vision. One might be critical of her erasure of their Blackness, and yet in this vein, Butler forces us to see these sitters as individuals not marked by racial difference. As emotionally charged objects of historical value, quilts are also shared and communally treasured by their makers and consumers. With lives of their own, quilts are vessels of memory and carry multiple intergenerational meanings. In this regard, Butler effectively materializes history through her intermedial quilted form of portraiture. She says of her work, quote, "My subjects are adorned with and made up of the cloth of our ancestor. If these visages are to be recreated and seen for the first time in a century, I want them to have their African ancestry back. I want them to take their place in American history," end quote. This quotation reveals a key and central premise that has remained a constant from the outset in Butler's work, and that is the notion of recovery, the recovery of history, and the recovery of Black subjectivity. The juxtaposition of the varied textural types of scraps is just as stimulating as their vibrant colors. Cotton, kente from Ghana, silk, tulle, wool, velvet, fragments derived from West African wax print cloths, which incidentally are linked to Dutch-made wax iterations of Indonesian batik patterns, and other print fabrics from South Africa are included in her works. Dutch wax print fabrics, though available in West Africa from the 19th century, did not become roaringly popular in West Africa until the 20th century. And yet their presence runs deep in the region due to circuitous colonial networks of Dutch and British copying, manufacturing, and trading of batik fabrics for different audiences. One of the chief sources and manufacturers of Butler's wax prints is the Dutch firm Vlisco, which was established in 1846 in Helmond, the Netherlands. With its fabrics produced in over 350,000 textile designs. These materials continue to be beloved by West African women today. And here I'm just showing you a mere sampling of, as I said, the thousands of prints that are sold on the website. One contemporary artist like Butler, who also draws from historical pictorial representations to subvert or challenge the meanings and presumptions latent in those images, is the Nigerian-British artist Yinka Shonibare. His installations of beheaded mannequins, staged to replicate scenes from canonical paintings in the history of art, such as Thomas Gainsborough's Mr. and Mrs. Andrews from 1748, seen here on the left, or Jean-Honoré Fragonard's The Swing from 1767, are grounded in a conceptual commitment to complicate any simplified notion of cultural authenticity and expose the textile's innate cultural ambiguity. In a way, Shonibare's reinvention of these fabrics in these scenes portraying European privilege and decadence that was born out of imperial expansionism, speaks to the fabrics being encoded with defiance. Butler's attachment to fabrics like wax prints, or Ghanaian kente, I argue, lies in a yearning to connect her subjects materially to the diasporic condition. Harking back to her father's Ghanaian heritage, Butler deliberately chooses to employ kente fabrics in her quilts, a material constructed through band-woven strips, either hand-sewn or machine-sewn together. Kente cloths traditionally held ceremonial and deeply symbolic value for the Ashanti peoples who donned them. Wrapped in a manner akin to how a toga is worn, kentes typically measure 5 feet by 8 feet. Each band or strip of fabric consists of geometric and abstract patterns, stripes, triangles, lozenges, chevrons, and crisscrosses, all rendered in red, golds, oranges, blues, and sometimes green and cotton and silk yarns. Much like the figural gold finials of Ashanti linguist staffs, seen here in this photograph, designs or patterns embedded in kente fabrics communicate proverbs and moral messages, and some bear associations with particular clans or convey markers of one's social status. As Doran Ross tells us, kente cloths, to the predominant Ashanti peoples of Ghana and Togo who wear them, inherently embody the trappings of royalty, power, and prestige. But just as it is for so many African-American women, sewing and quilting are intimately familial practices for Butler, intergenerationally passed down by her mother and grandmother. Butler recounts that in her youth, she would help out with sewing and quilt making at home. Quilts indeed connect ancestral roots, places, and experiences to present lives. In the historiography of African-American quilting. Questa Benberry and Carolyn Mazlumi have illustrated the long-standing, abundant variety of quilt-making styles and practices within the Black community, stretching back for centuries. Even before becoming a diasporic tradition, quilting has been a foundational practice in African textile arts, largely associated with women, the home, and notions of domesticity, being passed all the way down from great-grandmothers to great-granddaughters. It has also suffered the fate of exclusion from the so-called canon of art history because of its unjustly demoted status as a sort of quote-unquote low or popular art, as opposed to painting or sculpture. Since the 17th century, when enslaved Africans were brought to the United States from West and Equatorial Africa, African strip weaving and other fiber arts practices were blended with Euro-American quilting traditions. Slaves pieced together whatever scraps of cloth were made accessible to them to create practical clothing and blankets with symbolic value embedded in the arrangement of fabrics and patterns. Two African textile traditions are thought to have contributed to the development of African-American quilts, that of the Fon and Mande peoples. Applique, a sewing technique practiced in West Africa, and here I'm showing you an example of some Fon applique works from the Republic of Benin, was also taken up by African-American quilters who portrayed a range of religious, historical, and political themes. Harriet Powers' quilts depict stories from the Bible, narrative accounts of local Georgians, and symbols from Christian, Fon, Congo, and Masonic cultures. And she also uses the applique technique. Apart from the Fon people's tradition of applique textile making, Mande strip weaving, in which narrow bands of cloth are sewn together to create one garment, is a technique that is thought to be the precursor to the so-called crazy quilt patterns of African-American traditions, with their distinctive lines of variation and color. In her extensive studies of African-American quilting traditions, Gladys Marie Fry has analyzed the rich and varied forms of slave-produced quilts from the antebellum South. Common features of African-American quilts include the prevalence of strips of cloth, as well as lively colors and asymmetrical designs that were constructed by women through both hand sewing and portable small looms. No doubt rooted in West African textile conventions and symbolism, in which textiles convey status, affluence, and history through the fabric's visual forms, African-American quilters pay attention to how meaning is constructed through form. Such quilters focus in particular on the contrast and juxtaposition of colors, frequently commenting whether or not colors are sort of hitting each other in the right ways. And this is some sort of expression that Rosie Lee Tompkins mentioned. She actually said of her quilts that they have the colors have to hit and kind of find themselves juxtaposed to each other in the right way. All in all, meaning in African-American quilts is inscribed through the fabric, placement, and thread. Not only does each quilt tell a story, but the object itself offers viewers a window into the historical lives of its makers. Power is also conveyed in Butler's subjects, in part through scale, the scale of the quilts themselves. And in this way, Butler is in dialogue with some of her contemporary peers, such as the contemporary portraitists, Amy Sherald or Kehinde Wiley. A paucity of such large-scale, honorable, dignified images of African-American subjects in the history of art is what frustrated Sherald too, and so size remains an important element in her paintings as well. In stark contrast to their photographic reference, presumably printed as small or even pocket-sized portraits, Butler's quilted subjects are reimagined in scale, now life-size and sometimes even larger than life-sized, intimately gazing back at their viewers while inhabiting their bodily spaces. The quilted medium lends itself to an enlarged swath. With some works measuring 8 by 4 feet, the dimensions of her subjects often dynamically inhabit the spatial field of their viewers, commanding their gaze. From photographs of confident young Black American men from Harlem shot in his studio, Kehinde Wiley paints tableaus of these urban warriors hovering powerfully against gilded fleur-de-lis backdrops of swirling Rococo-inspired vines. They also demand their onlookers' attention by virtue of their size, echoing the vast and grand scale of European history paintings. In constructing his compositions this way, Kehinde Wiley's subjects possess a proud dominance that is otherwise deprived of Black men through systemic racism and inequities. Although her works might share more obvious visual and scalar affinities with the painted portraiture of contemporary artists like Amy Sherald or Kehinde Wiley, it is nonetheless vital to see how Butler's practice resonates with the fiber arts of an older generation of artistic interlocutors like Faith Ringgold and Romare Bearden. Trained originally as a painter like Butler, and a righteous pioneer in pointing to the endemic, systemic, and racial inequalities of American culture, Faith Ringgold intervened in the social discourses on race through her artworks of the 1960s, 70s, and 1980s. Just as Butler contributed to her mother's and grandmother's quilting practices, Ringgold too worked alongside her mother, Willie Posey, designing fashion pieces inspired by varying customs in African dress. And in 1967 and 1977, Faith Ringgold traveled with her to West Africa. One of her groundbreaking quote unquote story quilts, which you're seeing here in the slide, entitled "Who is Afraid of Aunt Jemima?" jabs at the derogatory stereotype of the pancake syrup icon of Aunt Jemima and the romanticized notion of the obsequious, domestic Southern mammy she represents, instead re-envisioning her as a successful, savvy entrepreneur. The work is arranged in a square grid of texts and images of characters contiguous to one another, framed by Black women in the periphery, all of whom chisel away at the constant discursive misrepresentations of Black women. Okay. There we go. Quilting is deeply interwoven with a history of collage, and Butler's praxis is also a tribute to that medium as well. Romare Bearden, who worked almost exclusively in collage since the 1960s, understood how vital quilting was to the African-American experience. In many of his works, he incorporates scraps and strips of fabric. But to better understand the sort of theoretical implications sort of latent in Butler's praxis, and specifically the theoretical implications of color in Butler's praxis, it is worth exploring the intellectual formations of her academic pedigree. Trained by the faculty of Howard University's renowned art department, Butler took cues early on in her artistic practice from some of the leaders of the COBRA movement. COBRA, of course, stands for the Coalition of Black Revolutionary Artists, which later became known as AfriCOBRA. So they later renamed it the African Commune of Bad Relevant Artists. She's taking cues from these movements, both of which formed in the late 1960s. One of COBRA's founders, Jeffrey Donaldson, became Dean of Fine Arts at Howard University, specifically when Butler was a student. And here I'm showing you a black ink sketch by Jeffrey Donaldson, one of her mentors, who sort of sketched some portraits of Afrocobra members. With a desire to give voice and visual form to Black histories and realities, COBRA founders, including and sort of besides Jeffrey Donaldson, individuals like Wadsworth Jarrell, Jay Jarrell, Gerald Williams, and Barbara Jones Hogu, and subsequent Afrocobra artists like Carolyn Lawrence, Nelson Stevens, Omar Lama, Sherman Beck, Howard Mallory, and Frank Smith. All of these individuals sought to foreground social, political, and economic issues and inequities through their works. According to one of Afrocobra's founders, Wadsworth Jarrell, the movement strove to create a visual language that represented an African-American aesthetic rooted in the culture, in sort of the gritty culture of Black neighborhoods of Chicago, and is significantly embedded in African aesthetics. And here I'm showing you a particular important scene called basically a street in Chicago that was dubbed the Wall of Respect. And it was filled basically with painted portraits of important African-American individuals and kind of cultural creative types and intellectuals who really contributed to American culture, as it were. Garnering inspiration from urban life and American political realities, these artists looked equally towards African visual culture for inspirational symbols, borrowing oftentimes heavily from stylistic motifs from African sculpture, mythology, and religious practices, such as Egyptian ankhs, references to Yoruba deities, and so forth. And so I'm showing you this in this sort of newspaper clipping because obviously we can sort of see references to ancient Egyptian pharaonic headwear, the sort of Nemes headdress of Old Kingdom pharaohs. In terms of their experimentation with different types of media, Afrocobra artists employed a broad range of practices in their art making: patchwork and applique, tie-dye, collage, intense colors, graffiti-inspired writing. A signature principle adopted by Afrocobra artists is that of the implementation of what they called, quote unquote, Kool-Aid colors. And Kool-Aid is not spelled actually like the drink Kool-Aid, although it's kind of riffing off of it. They actually spelled Kool-Aid, C-O-O-L, and then A-D-E. So Kool-Aid colors, which were bright and vivid colors celebrated for their intensity and saturation. Here I'm showing you the work of Jay Jarrell, who was sort of a fiber artist as well, and created lots of clothes that obviously were sort of inspired by these Kool-Aid colors. Such Kool-Aid colors, neon yellows, fire engine reds, key lime chartreuses, royal purples, can be seen in the Black Power silk screen prints of Barbara Jones Hogu, in the sort of Fauvis-like portraits of African Americans by Carolyn Lawrence, or in the painted silk textiles sewn into finely tailored dresses like that of Jay Jarrell, which I showed you in the last slide. We can also see them in the absorbing painted mosaicist portraits of Wadsworth Jarrell. And here we're seeing a work called Liberation Soldiers. And these are just absolutely incredible works to behold. And you literally get kind of sucked into these works. The first Afrocobra show of 52 works, entitled Afrocobra 10 in Search of a Nation, was exhibited at the Studio Museum in Harlem in 1970. Inasmuch as it was an ode to African-American visual culture and heritage, it was also a searing critique and disavowal of any notion of a codified art historical canon. Overall, though, Afrocobra artists wished their art, and art by and for African Americans, to resonate with and remain accessible to working class Black communities across the United States. In their revolutionary aims, Afrocobra did not concern itself with the white-dominated art world establishments of prominent museums and galleries, and instead chose purposefully alternative channels of publicity, promoting their works through African American venues and gallerists. And here I'm showing you some ticket stubs for the Afrocobra shows. The super real quality of Kool-Aid color beams through Butler's oeuvre. Like her Afrocobra mentors, Butler jettisons naturalistic brown and ebony skin tones, instead selecting deeply rich and eye-catching colors to convey the range and diversity of African Americans. She says, and I quote, "I choose bright Technicolor cloth to represent our skin because these colors are how African Americans refer to our complexions," end quote. Curator Erica Warren posits that Butler's deliberate choice of colorful fabrics for her subject skin tones is a means to contest the pervasiveness of colorism within the Black community. Apart from the formal properties and political agency implied in Butler's usage of color, in keeping with Afrocobra's commitment to maintaining the deep-seated bonds to the African diaspora, her deliberate choice of subject matter or fabric pattern often makes literal allusions to a real and imagined African homeland. So this particular piece, called Black Star Family, First Class Tickets to Liberia, envisions a dapper early 20th century African-American family unit, a mother, father, and two young sons, just before their departure via Marcus Garvey's Black Star Line to the African country of Liberia, which was founded as a right of return nation in 1822 for previous enslaved, freeborn Black African Americans. Decked out in their Sunday best, the family's fine fashions comprise an amalgamation of multicolored fabrics in arabesques or geometrically inspired patterns like checkers and chevrons. One black and white fabric on the breast of the father's suit features a portrait of Nelson Mandela in roundels, surely a reference to the continued global struggle for equality, dignity, and justice for Black lives. In this piece and in others, the semiotics of Butler's patterns directly denote diasporic networks. Symbols embedded in the garments of her subjects infer both the weight and the constraints of global capitalism, as in the prominently displayed euro sign on the sitter's jacket in A Man's Worth from 2019, or in ways in which globalization interconnects disparate diasporic communities through air travel, as in the magenta, ochre, and purple airplanes seen in the pants of the sitter of this particular work, I Am Not Your Negro, referencing, of course, James Baldwin's acclaimed text, though, of course, visually based on a photograph by Dorothea Lange. Together, the colors and signs of her subjects speak to the enmeshed, interwoven, and truly global fabric of African diasporic communities. Although Butler's photographic sitters are neither her direct ancestors nor intimate role models, her mission is nevertheless a deeply personal one. She seeks to recognize their memory because of the persistent marginalization and ostracization of Black communities, historically and presently. Based on her own family's scattered roots, to use the late cultural critic Stuart Hall's phrase, Butler testifies that she knows these folks' stories intimately. She says, and I quote, "I know about my grandmother's birth in Plaquemine Parish, Louisiana. I know about my Aunt Sheila, whose family left Mississippi for Chicago in the 1940s. I know about my own father, who left Ghana in 1960 with a scholarship to study in the United States and a suitcase with one shirt and a pair of pants. I know the pride of hard work and the dignity of these people because they are my people. I can imagine their lives because they are me and I am them. I grew up listening to the tales of my elders, and I heard about what it felt like to be cold and hungry, but also to have love for one family," end quote. Butler's familial story comprises a series of threads woven into a much larger, common and collective African-American experience of the brutal legacies of slavery in the Jim Crow era, of the Great Migration of African Americans to the metropolitan cities of the Midwest, and of the transatlantic diasporic ties to continental Africa. As cultural theorist Kobina Mercer articulates, portraiture is often reclaimed by diasporic artists because of its capacity to reconstitute the social self through its representational politics. By resurrecting portraits of African Americans of the past, Butler redefines these figures' place both within the historical record and within our collective memory. And yet, materially, she challenges the inherent reproducibility and mechanical production of these photographs by creating an intricate, singular portrait of the hand. Though the vast majority of her source material stems from photographic prints of African Americans taken during the Great Depression by photographers working for the Works Progress Administration, which is also known as the WPA, which lasted from 1935 to 1943, or the Farm Security Administration, or also known as the FSA, which lasted from 1937 to 1942, now housed in the Library of Congress. Some of her work is also inspired by earlier portraits of African Americans, many of whom remain nameless in the historical record. In photographs portraying wary or impoverished sharecroppers and tenant farmers, the FSA's task was to direct poor, mostly white farmers towards social services, that is, healthcare, nutrition consultants, hospitals, education, and so forth. And so even in the FSA's documentation of downtrodden farmers, Black subjects were marginalized. Of course, since the mid-19th century, when photography became globally ubiquitous, the technology reflected the shifting social realities of race relations with emancipation and abolition. Yet, more often than not, the archival record leaves its Black subjects nameless, and Bisa Butler affirms that through her quilting practice. She seeks to inject life back into her subjects, giving back identities that have been lost to history, as she says. With bold patchworks of patterns and bursts of color, Butler honors and invigorates these formerly lost subjects, and she notes, quote, "It becomes almost like this spiritual conversation between me and the subject," end quote. Jordan Carter concisely underscores one of Butler's central contributions in complicating the stories underlying these photographic records, in that she, quote, "destabilizes the notion of an institutional archive as a fixed or authoritative index," end quote. Butler's work, therefore, offers her audience a chance to read and reimagine history through alternative narratives by recasting these otherwise forgotten subjects in a literally different light. Butler's piece, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, from 2019, a reference to Maya Angelou's 1969 famed autobiography about the traumas of racism and violence, is actually based off of a photograph by Thomas E. Askew, capturing 4 poised and elegant African-American women on the steps of Atlanta University, which was originally included in W.E.B. Du Bois's album, Negro Life in Georgia, USA, from 1899 to 1900. As Deborah Willis and Barbara Krauthammer explain, Du Bois championed photography as a means to represent African Americans as respectable and morally upright by combating racist stereotypes of Black folk and contradicting commonplace assumptions and prejudgments about Black criminality. Du Bois's photographs of African Americans in Georgia work to undermine the abundant visual culture of the era that sought to portray African Americans as subservient and submissive in order to uphold racist ideologies that supported discrimination and segregation. Alternatively, his collaborative portraits and albums of African Americans undertaken with Askew reject the visual quote unquote evidence of racist pseudoscience and instead ennoble his subjects, providing a carefully crafted vision of African American elegance, sophistication, and cultural elitism. And this is again from Du Bois's project. In the photograph, women confidently gaze at the viewer, dressed in boater hats, plain skirts, frilly Gigot sleeve tops, with their bodies twisted but relaxed in a manner that axially divides the composition down the center. Yet in Butler's reincarnation of these women, they lean against a green and white diamond backdrop, their tops billow and puff, lending a sense of illusionism to their bodies. And their skirts comprise of mismatching wax print fabrics featuring patterns of hearts, stationary fans, pumps, and glittering jewels. The women's skin tones radiate shades of tangerine, cerulean, burgundy, and mauve. They are no longer still onlookers frozen in the historical record, but spirited subjects shining with presence and vitality, wielding their education and status to empower themselves in the face of the omnipresent social injustices of their day. Butler's intermedial fiber practice is preoccupied with resuscitating Black subjects in order to reinvent how they are remembered through the photographic archive itself. In its tactile dimensions, fabric literally enables these subjects from the past to be felt and thus take on a new transformational embodiment. And moreover, the exuberant juxtaposition of color and patterns enlivens their memory. In conclusion, there's an undeniable level of polish and refinement to each of the photographic subjects brought back to life by Butler. While respectability is inarguably encoded in the photographic reference and the postures and poses of the original sitter's sartorial manners, Butler's fiber arts reinterpretation stays true to the historical record while also endowing her subjects with a newfound freedom in color. Color and pattern are liberatory mechanisms in Butler's work, relieving her subjects from the conformity to which they were bound in their day, while giving them meaning and resonance to the audiences that they address today. Broom Jumpers, which you're seeing here from 2019, constructed of cotton, silk, wool, and velvet cloth fragments, presents one such dapper couple from the 1930s. Presumably newlyweds, the man and woman stand arm in arm. The act of jumping over a broom was a common end-of-wedding ritual for clandestinely paired African-American slaves, forbidden from marrying each other in the United States. Leaning intimately towards one another, the gentleman wears a long-tailed, double-breasted coat and cravat, holding a flat cap at his knee, while his partner dons a long buttoned frock with a wide-brimmed asymmetrical hat and laced heeled boots. Against a red backdrop decorated with soft pink flowers, the couple's stylish composure signals their upward social mobility in their flashy, contrasting West African wax prints. But taken together, one can see how Butler's photorealistic quilts bring life to African Americans of the past, the reconstitution of her subjects through the collage, through applique, quilting of scraps from Ghanaian kente or West African wax print fabrics, points to the ways that Butler connects her historical figures to an ancestral homeland, weaving their identities into the diasporic fold. Quilts, in this instance, textiles that give comfort, keep us warm, are the vessels of memory passed down from generation to generation. They are the very life-giving material of historic preservation. What Butler preserves through her Technicolor quilts are lives and stories that truly matter, never to be neglected or forgotten again. Thank you so much. All right, I'm ready to take questions from the audience.
Yeah, Nancy, thank you very much for really this fascinating talk. Yeah, I learned a lot. I was really very intrigued by many elements that you shared with us today, and I was able to see Butler's exposition 2 years ago in Chicago. So I'm very happy that also I know her work in a more kind of face-to-face mode.
Yes.
So thank you very much, Nancy. And I have a few questions, but I will wait for the audience to engage with you in like a fruitful discussion. So maybe if we have any questions now, we can share them. Please feel free to write your question in the chat box, or you can unmute yourself for sure and ask your question directly to Nancy. So thank you very much. Yeah, is someone going to ask a question, or should I go? Okay, maybe I will go, and then I will, give some moment for the audience to digest all the really very interesting topics that you have been sharing with us today. So Nancy, I am really for sure fascinated by the many elements that you highlighted through Butler's work, especially, of course, the idea of connecting with transatlantic heritage, and also with the Black community, and so on and so forth. And you mentioned, like in the middle of your talk, about the nature of sewing and quilt making as something, of course, related to women, domesticity and labor, time consuming, and so on and so forth. I was wondering if you also tackle this aspect from another point of view, which would be the subversive, in a sense, nature of her work, as especially I'm very interested in the way she is depicting more specifically the women, generally speaking, and with the notion that you, of course, started with by saying that we see that the subjects are gazing back to the viewer, right?
Yes.
So I was wondering if you also are interested in this aspect of her work as being, as having this kind of subversive nature, and especially by giving women this kind of agency and empowerment, not only through their gaze, but also through their postures, as you have in your first slide, for instance.
Yes. No, 100%. That's such a good point, and such a rich question, Naveen. Thank you so much. Yeah, no, I mean, I think, you know, as I mentioned in the talk, I think without question, Butler is very much kind of, obviously she's very much indebted in some sense to those that she trained under at Howard University. I think the Afro-Cobra movement is without question, just simply by definition, a political movement. I mean, obviously it was an artistic collective, you know, that really wanted to kind of give power back to Black subjectivity, and specifically Black creative subjectivity. But I think that, you know, one of her prime mentors was Jeffrey Donaldson, and I mean, he is sort of one of these founders of the Afro-Cobra movement, which, as I said, was by definition subversive in nature, and kind of happening at the same time as the Black Panther movement, and kind of notions and discourses of Black power that were circulating around the civil rights movement, and so forth. So I think one cannot actually dissociate from her work the deliberately kind of political nature of her work. I kind of focused on these sort of, I don't want to call them like sentimental aspects, but the aspects of memory, right? Because I think for me, you know, I resonated so strongly with her work because, I mean, as you know, Naveen, I am a sort of first generation Egyptian American myself. And so I have sort of lived through a lot of my father's experiences, you know, from Egypt in the 1940s and 50s, even here in the United States. So this idea of diaspora and how kind of subsequent generations kind of process diaspora is something that I really just kind of strongly identified with on a very personal level with Butler's work. But I think, you know, as you said, I mean, power and kind of power differentials, and
Sure.
the subversive nature is there without question.
Sounds good. I think we have a question from Pilumi Folajimi. Do you see it, or should I read it for you? I can read it for you if you want.
Oh, I think so. I think, let's see here. Oh, you observed cultural defiance and resistance against Western hegemony as visible in the art. Thank you. How are you able to juxtapose Shonibare's African sensibility and Bisa Butler's African American sensibility as demonstrated in their individual arts? Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think without question, Shonibare is dealing with, yes, an African sensibility, but both of them are dealing with kind of diasporic concerns, as I see it, at least. I think, you know, Shonibare himself has a kind of conflicted relationship with, obviously is a conflicted relationship with England. He has been, I think, named or sort of titled, a member of the British Empire, when he himself and basically his entire oeuvre and practice is critiquing British imperial history and sort of the history of the European imperial enterprise. But I think that Butler's practice is not critiquing empire per se, as so much as it is critiquing the history of Black disenfranchisement. I think both of them ascribe or reinscribe power back in their subjects through the medium of cloth and specifically the wax print fabric. But obviously they're sort of achieving and working towards different ends, if that makes sense. I brought up Shonibare because I thought, well, in the context of writing my paper, I was trying to think of contemporary artists that deal with wax prints, and Shonibare was sort of one of these pioneering contemporary artists who really kind of wrestled with the inherent complexity and specifically the inherent kind of economic and historical complexity of wax print fabrics. So I don't know if I'm actually answering your question, Palumi, but I think they are working towards very different goals, if that makes any sense. Thank you for that question. That is an excellent point, though.
Thank you, Nancy.
Is there anything else in the chat? I haven't.
No, not yet, but it's almost 1 p.m. So of course, anyone who has to go, feel free to leave the Zoom room. Otherwise, we can stay a few minutes if anyone has a question. And please, if you also would like to raise your hand, and we can unmute you as well. So.
I apologize, I kept my camera off because my internet was giving me issues leading up to the call. So it's not that I didn't want to engage with the audience. So forgive me, everyone on the call.
No worries. Any other questions or comments?
I see one comment pop up. No, that's from Palumi.
Yes,
okay.
I don't see anymore.
Okay, here we go. I think that's it.
Yes. Maybe last quick question, Nancy. How about the materiality of the fabric? Because obviously there's a kind of an interactive relationship that can, be that can exist, between the viewer and the maker, the quilt maker. So I was wondering, how would you maybe just in a few words, talk a little bit about the sensorial experience, about the materiality of the quilt itself as a way of also to kind of reconnect, with, as you said, with the ancestors, but also because of the nature of the fabric itself.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, quilts in the African American community, but also in the American kind of tradition of quilt making itself, quilts are passed down intergenerationally, as I said. And so there's obviously something inherently intimate with the fabric, right? First, I mean, you're pointing to the sensorial qualities, the material qualities of the quilt, but I think within those sensorial innate and sort of inherent sensorial properties, there is something kind of powerful about the haptic nature of them, the material nature of them. I think that, you know, obviously in the American quilt making tradition, you know, obviously fabrics can sometimes be taken from old t-shirts, from things that actually have been worn on the body. So there's a way in which quilts also are sort of deeply connected to people's bodies in interesting ways, right? People's dresses can be deconstructed, or, you know, a man's suit might be deconstructed to be embedded in a quilt. So not only is it memory, but it's also, it also kind of absorbs an aura of the people who were kind of attached in some way to the fabrics themselves. So I think there's a way in which materiality and the sensorial is also tied to the materiality and the corporeality of personhood and the bodies of individuals themselves. And so, you know, I think in that way, quilts are just so powerful. And, you know, as I mentioned in my talk, they have been for too long kind of relegated to the, you know, hierarchy implicit in art history of kind of belonging to the low or popular or folk arts tradition. And I think that obviously that's totally, that's totally bogus and unjustified, because they are aesthetically stunning and also just such important vessels of historical memory as objects. So yeah.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah. On this positive note about connectivity and materiality, actually, to remind you, Nancy, we have a really great collection of African fabrics here at UW Madison, at I think the School of Human Ecology, and also the library, the Memorial Library. So thank you very much for this, again, fascinating talk. And thank you very much for all for being here, and for African Cultural African Studies program for organizing this Africa at Noon series. So thank you very much all, and thank you very much Nancy, Harry, Yinka, and Alia. Thank you a lot.
Thank you. Thank you.